welcome to the third round of our parenting courses. Tonight we're going to talk about middle school and high school years. And so we'll start off with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. St. Joseph, St. Mary, and Jesus, please watch over us tonight, instill us with inspiration, guide us as parents. Help us to fulfill your desires for us as parents and guiders of our children, and help us get them to heaven. In Jesus' name we pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I am Dr. Andrew Landrigan. This is my wife, Dr. Jennifer Landrigan. We are parents of 7 children, and we have been practicing pediatrics for right around 23 years now.
As Andy said, we're going to talk about the middle school and high school age group. And when you get to this point, you've already been working on a lifetime of foundation with your children. We started off that first week talking about infancy and toddlerhood. And during that first year of life, you spend it the day in and the day out, showing your children how much you love them, giving them that sense of security, meeting every need that they have without totally giving them what they think they want the second they give it, or that you don't give it the second they want it necessarily. But you nonetheless are showing them that you love them by the care you give. We talked about in toddlerhood how you start establishing boundaries and you want to be consistent in how to respond when we're doing that. We talked about not using too many words. You want to make sure your boundaries are clear and then respond when they're broken right away. Keeping our training in view and in perspective, remembering all along what our ultimate goal is, that being to help our children get to heaven, hopefully to help our spouses get to heaven, and to do that as a family. And so as we set up those boundaries, we're helping our children work on their inner discipline, their self-discipline, their impulse control, and their ability to be obedient. It's pretty minor when you're 2 or 3, but as you grow, the stakes grow a little higher. And ultimately, well, we do care if they're obedient to mom and dad, but mostly we care if they're obedient to the will of God and to the rules that He set up for all of us. And so in those early years, you're already establishing that. Then you move on to those preschool times where lots of their learning is done from pretend play, learning to play with siblings, learning to think about others. Maybe there's a younger sibling by that point. And we talked about the self-esteem that occurs as your preschooler is thinking about the needs of someone else. And maybe it's not a younger sibling, maybe it's a grandparent, or maybe it's a neighbor who needs help. But they're starting to learn how good it feels to help somebody else. And we want to incorporate that. It's good for our children to help, not to perceive being in a family as being the one who is always served. So again, you're laying that foundation. Then they move on to elementary school, and their peers become a bigger influence. They want to be like their peers, but also need that security of home. And that comes from your unwavering consistency in, again, knowing what our boundaries are, knowing what the expectations are, and then that there's going to be accountability. We talked about trying to help our children, our young children, learn to be organized. And some of that comes from the simple picking up of our toys after they've been playing, rather than having the room look like a cyclone hit. Maybe we're going to pick up one activity before we move to the next. So that has laid the groundwork for maybe how to be a good student, how to organize our schoolwork. I know even in elementary now, they are encouraging planners to be digital. I still feel like it kind of helps for children and students to have a paper planner. Some of that may be our generation, but I do think it helps for it to be visible, to be something you can touch. You can open a page and see your to-do list on the paper, just like we feel like not all books should be electronic. We talked about play being, within play, Children need to be able to have things that they're building and creating, and so we want to limit that springtime. And so through elementary, you're continuing to build that sense of security. Your children know you're going to take care of everything they need. They know you are there for them. They know that you are going to love them unconditionally. And then that next step, that we're going to enter into tonight, in the middle school, becomes a much more challenging time in some ways, because children are trying to figure out just who they are. And we're hoping that we know who they are, but that peer influence becomes much greater. As a society, unfortunately, there's this big push for, well, I say unfortunately, it depends on what we're talking about, I suppose, but this push for children's rights. Well, of course, we want to take care of our children, and we want to make sure they are respected. But on the flip side, it doesn't mean that all freedom is supposed to be handed to them as they enter into the 6th grade, because they're not ready for it. And so, as our children are starting to move into that adolescent phase, and we've been talking a little bit about how their bodies are going to change. It's time to make sure you're talking openly about how relationships go, as far as friendships. Our world sometimes acts like it's fine to have dating relationships even in middle school, or it seems fun to have lots of co-ed activities. Not that they have to be wrong, but the focus should be on building healthy friendships. Dating ultimately is about figuring out who you might want to spend the rest of your life with. And we don't need our 12 and 13-year-olds thinking about getting married. They should still be thinking about learning about God more, establishing their love and their service to God, their family, how they're growing in their family responsibilities, how they're growing as a student, and just building in their character, not being so worried about who they might want as their boyfriend or girlfriend. We talked last week about the need to be really careful about screen time or internet exposure. Middle school is awful when children have too much screen time. Social media has created so much extra anxiety and stress in our world, and it's very popular. The kids love it, and sometimes even something as simple as a dance app creates extra drama in a child's life. And the relationships, I don't even know if the children think the relationships are built on what they're seeing on those apps, but they're very superficial. But boy, do we see lots of kids hurt by them. And so our recommendation is not to allow them. We're not in favor of middle schoolers or even high schoolers for the most part and having phones, certainly not in their homes. The laptops are coming home, but we think it's best to have them out in the kitchen or the main area of the house. School laptops should be pretty well protected, so you shouldn't have to worry too much. But we need to still pay attention. The other thing that happens is maybe you've got your rules, you have your organization at home, you know exactly how things go after school, the kids come home, maybe there's a little break, we get right to our work because in life we want to take care of our tasks before we just relax. Otherwise we end up at the end of the night with extra stress because now we have a deadline that's much closer. And we know it's allowed on our computer in our house. But in middle school, sometimes there's more visiting to someone else's house. And a little coaching before your child goes is a good idea. Just a reminder to say, even at times when I'm not with you, I still want the best for you. And remember, God is who we're trying to please, and He's always watching. And even if there's something that you feel like you're not wanting to necessarily share with me, He knows all about it. You can talk to Him about it. But if, when you're going to Johnny's house, maybe their rules are a little easier than our rules, I am still asking you to follow our rules because we love you most. We think we know what's best for you. And so we should always follow the harder role, so to speak. But it's really good to know the families that your children are going to spend time with. We talked about in early elementary, starting that communication of you want to surround yourself with people who are going to help you be your best. You want to pick friends who care about following the rules, care about their families, care about filling their thoughts with good things. There's a lot of bad in the world. We want to try to stay away from that. Our middle schoolers, even our high schoolers, aren't supposed to have to solve the world's problems. They need the sense of that security that no matter what happens, mom and dad have this. They're in charge. They always come through. Okay.
And so one of the things that we talked about was early on that there would be times where the path of least resistance would be easier. Oh, a crying child will be easiest just to pacify and give them what they want. And the same could also be said for a whining child, that giving them what they want may stop the whining. And that's where the phone is a big deal. It will put you in a very slim minority if your kids don't have a cell phone in middle school. But you're responsible for this individual, not all those other parents. And it's important for a parent to say, as they hand over a phone to a child, I'm willing to be a smaller part of your life, and I'm willing to accept that I'm giving access to you by other people, some of whom I don't know, as I hand you this phone. And so the question for a parent when they hand over a phone and they admit that those things are true is, why am I giving you this phone? Am I giving you this phone because it's more convenient for me? Am I giving you this phone because it will make you happy? Am I giving you this phone because it will make you more popular or feel like you fit in more? And in answering those questions, I think the answer to those questions may stop a person from handing over a phone to a child. But we've had a computer expert come to church here and talk to all of us as parents on all the blocks that we're supposed to put on phones and our computers. And I think if they're that dangerous that we have to put block after block after block on a digital device, it's probably really worth considering whether this is something that we're supposed to give to our kids at all. I agree with what Jennifer said. I think our experience has been generally that the school computers are pretty safe. And so outside of the school computers, the digital devices that are used at our house need to be in the family area, which is generally in the kitchen and the eating area, so that our kids would feel like, even though generally they are good kids, there is somebody who's there looking out for them. What can be seen on a screen in a split second can't be erased from somebody's brain. And there is less temptation to look for something that you think is edgy if you know you've got family right there in the room with you. So we don't want to put kids in a situation where they're more likely to be tempted. Looking at illicit material, especially for males during middle school, is really common. Father Ben had a statistic when he was here that 80% of males in 8th grade who have their own phone with internet access will have looked at abhorrent websites within the last 7 days. And those are young men who are presumably going to be expected to be somebody's husband at some point. And after they have looked at that over and over and over again, they aren't going to have the right idea of what marriage is supposed to be. And they're not going to be good spouses. And the family is already under attack enough without having us as parents hand over a phone and say, here, don't be tempted to do anything wrong. That's a little bit like last week when we talked about not backing kids into a corner and giving them a way out by allowing them to think that if they lie, they're going to get out of it. Don't ask a 3-year-old when you know they broke the vase, did you break that vase? We already know the answer to it, so let's address the problem. In this case, we already know that maybe a 6th grade, definitely a 7th and 8th grade boy is going to have questions about how human life regenerates itself. Don't put him in a position where he's going to be more tempted. I'm not sure why anybody would do that, except they can't endure the whining that goes on. And I would ask you, man up, whether you're the mom or the dad, man up and handle the whining. And then secondly, if you can't stand the thought that your child will be different, then I would question whether you're willing to be different. We should seem different than the world around us. We are Catholic Christians. We live in this world, but we are not supposed to be of this world. And so the way we live our lives should be different. Kids that grow up in our house expect that their rules are going to be different than everybody else's. It in some way is kind of nice that we have 7 kids because it's a gang and they all know that they're being treated similarly and everybody down the line is going to have the same rules. That's comforting to each of them because they're all in it together. I can see how it would be harder if there was only one and they thought, wow, this is really a ripoff. I've got the only parents in the world who will think that I can't have a phone in middle school. If you're out there as a parent, you should just reassure that they're not the only ones who don't have a phone. The situation with the phone for girls is a little different than that, in that girls are social beings. They're about relationships. And so, whereas boys hardly ever would get together to talk, girls get together to talk, they'll get together to chat. And there sometimes is a pecking order in their relationships. And there's a lot of pressure, particularly I think for 7th and 8th grade girls, within a school day, of that pressure that's applied in various ways, whether it's the way hair's done or clothes are worn or who's sitting with who at the lunch table. If you throw texting capability in then after school for an additional 6 hours, the pressure is like a vice. It's he said and she said, and can you believe she said, and who in the world would wear that, and boy, they must not have enough money to afford anything. And it just goes on and on and on. I once had a patient who was being spoken about by 2 other people, and the question was, what would you do if you were so-and-so? And the response was, commit suicide. That was copied and sent to the patient. And all of that viciousness that goes on could be saved if you're just not part of it. And sure, people can talk about stuff that went on the night before, but if you're not in the midst of it with texting and thinking that your next breath depends on what text comes back, you will save your kids a lot of misery, especially girls. And I have often said that I could probably get rid of half of the teenage depression if I could just get rid of girls' phones. And I think that's not much of a stretch. It would be a great idea.
Yes, before we move on to high school, middle school is a time where there's going to be more talk about puberty, how their bodies change, and then even married life. And as you are talking about with your child, we feel like that's the perfect time to talk about that gift that God has given to us. From before we knew our children, God knew them. And in a world where it seems like there are people who don't want to say there are any absolutes in life, the absolute truth is God gives us our life, and He gives it to us as we are. As parents, we love our children unconditionally. It doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter if you use good grammar. As parents, we're going to love you anyway. And as you talk about growing, maybe from, we'll talk about girls, I guess, to begin with, but changing from a little girl into the blessings of maybe someday getting to be a mom, that makes it a lot easier to then, I think it helps to have a text or some kind of a kid-friendly book. And there are several out there, I think, that they talk about the virtue of being who God created and changing from that little girl into that young lady and how to do that virtuously. And some of that is in how you present yourself. We talked a little bit last week about the importance of dressing modestly in a way that you kind of attract respect and attract the right personalities around you rather than maybe attracting more troublesome personalities around you. And so that conversation comes into play. I think that it's important to know where your child is developmentally, to know when to give all the details. And we don't want to make things more complicated than they are. But some kids, children in 6th or 7th grade, they're ready, for the exact anatomy of this is what this looks like, probably in a drawing, not necessarily in a photograph. And an anatomy book is an okay thing to use, and it can be pretty simple, but with labels, it just makes it a little easier, I think, to say. And look, and God made you this way, so that someday, when you're married, and when God thinks it's right, maybe you'll be able to have a baby that grows, and this is how God designed the system. It's all good. I understand it can be kind of frightening, and I think acknowledging that as you're talking to her makes sense. But that reassurance that this is healthy. This is how God designed it, and God's perfect. So He knows best. He knows what we need. And He'll give it to us when we need it. If your child is maybe not quite ready for all the details, you do it more in stepwise fashions. Just like maybe in 4th grade, you need to give a little bit of, discussion about maybe how things are changing. We're going to need to shower more. We're going to need to start running our person every day. But maybe they're not ready for everything. So you can do it in steps. And somewhat, I think the discussion is similar for boys, where you don't want to overwhelm them. It's just a different system, so there aren't, so many details to talk about, but still definitely changes.
I think when speaking to boys, it might be a good idea just to talk to them about some of the language that they might hear so that they are aware of what is being spoken about. A gentleman needs to know when he is supposed to leave a conversation, and if a young man is completely clueless about the words that are being used or even the topic that's being discussed, he may find himself in the midst of a very confusing conversation, but not know that he's not supposed to be there at all. That it's important that if someone is being spoken of in a way that's not respectful, especially if a given, a name is applied to the conversation, that girl, that young lady, is God's daughter, and he's not supposed to be part of a conversation in which God's daughter is being spoken of that way. And it would certainly be great for him to speak up and defend her, but at the very least, he shouldn't be part of it, shouldn't give any reinforcement to what's being spoken about. He should, at the very least, just get out of there. That also is important for dads to recognize that their role as leader in a house is, even if dad doesn't outwardly speak about how women are supposed to be treated, it should be obvious that he treats his wife as if she is the most important person in his life. And that would include that dads aren't supposed to make comments about how good looking other women are, not supposed to give the old to the son as he's growing up. That this is serious. You're looking eventually for a high school boy. He is looking to establish a friendship with a girl. It's not supposed to be one of those, it's not supposed to be something where there would be conversations that would be off limits about what he and she might do on a given night, or laughing about innuendo, that everything should be above board. Dads who engage in that are encouraging behavior that they shouldn't be. And they're not living up to, certainly not living up to my expectation of what a good dad would be for his son. In
Another just little comment on those conversations. It's also good to remind our children if there's something being said or language being used that they don't understand, don't act like you agree, because then you get just pulled right in and find yourself in kind of a tough, can find yourself in a tough spot.
by default in our parenting, and this applies to 2-year-olds just like it does to 12-year-olds or 18-year-olds, whatever the behavior that's going on is, if there isn't an attempt to address that behavior, then by default, that is acceptable behavior. Because the child's reference is going to be, well, they didn't say anything. Secondary to that, a parent who says something, but then doesn't really follow through if there's a consequence that needed, also is saying, I really don't care that much about that behavior. It doesn't bother me that much. And so, by default, then that behavior ends up being okay too. And so, when a parent, I will sometimes see a parent and I'll walk into the room, hey, how are you guys? And the parent's response is, well, he's a teenager. And it's like we're supposed to have this cathartic moment between two adults and understand that this person is a teenager. And I find that a little sad because it's supposed to be fun to be a teenager, and it's not supposed to be constant parent-child conflict. And if we've done our job right early on, it shouldn't have to be terrible. And a parent who is willing to accept that a teenager is supposed to be insular and defiant and talk back and want lots of alone time and be grumpy with siblings, if that's acceptable because they're teenagers, those are going to be long teenage years. So that goes back to recognizing what can sometimes be normal is not okay. And so it needs to be talked about. Particularly if a mom is willing to sort of just be growled at by a teenage boy, that is what you're going to get from some teenage boys, because they'll sort of do what they can get away with as long as mom continues to provide what they need. And moms who are nurtured by nature will sometimes just continue to offer all the pleasantries and all the good things in life to this person who isn't behaving in any way like he respects her. But yet, mother is training him on how you treat women. And so if he is being trained that it's okay to growl at the woman of the house, his future wife may have some issues with you at some point because you trained him poorly. If he's a slob, you have trained him poorly. If dad is cleaning up the car, and I've moved now into later teenage years for this example, but if dad goes out on Saturday morning and he's going to clean out the car, and there are empty beer cans in the back of the car, and the teenager thinks, oh no, I left those in the car. Dad's going to find them. And nothing is ever said about the empty beer cans in the car. Well, by default, Dad is saying, it's okay that I found some empty beer cans in the car, because it was never addressed. And so you've just accepted that your teenager is going to drink alcohol. And I think sometimes it's because parents don't want to feel like a hypocrite because they engaged in some behaviors that they wish they wouldn't have as teenagers. So the feeling of being a hypocrite is just too great for them, and they won't try to address it with their teenager. Sometimes it's because parents have had big mouths and have bragged about their experiences that weren't good, but didn't talk about it as if it was a bad experience. They were bragging about it, and really tied a few on when I was in high school. Now don't do that. Those are not the kind of stories to tell your kids. We don't ever want to glorify behavior that doesn't glorify God. As you are approaching Sunday Mass, I don't think that, at least in our house, I don't think it would ever be questioned that somebody was going to go to Sunday Mass. But it's important for that to look different from our perspective. It's important for that to look different than if we were just going to go to a pizza place and go out to eat. We're going to dress differently because we're going to see the King of Kings. And he's going to give us his body, blood, soul, and divinity. It's the greatest thing that we will do all week. And so it's going to look different when we go to Mass. And so people are expected to look nice. We are going to look like we are ready to be there, and we are ready to go to the King's feast. Don't be afraid to have high expectations for your kids. And maybe they'll sort of kind of look a little draggy when you say, yeah, I think that's not quite for church. I'd like you to spiff that up a little bit. But they will get the idea, and you can always lead by example. So make sure that you're doing the same. This isn't, going to Mass isn't a last minute thought, hey, we got to get this down, realize we're running out of time, hey, let's go. It's something that's planned well ahead of time. Everybody knows you're going to go, so they've got plenty of time to get themselves ready.
So what if you have a teenager who's decided maybe they don't think they want to go to Mass? They're not so sure they're buying the whole faith idea. Well, we've tried to do our homework. We've tried along the way to make sure that was an important part of our life. And now they're saying, no, they want to stay home. And actually, they think they're going to stay home. But while they're living with us as parents, and while we're providing all of their needs, we have the responsibility to make sure they go to Mass with us. There isn't really an option not to go to Mass. We talked last week about how even with travel sports or whatever activity it might be, there's nothing more important than going to Mass. And we believe going to Mass as a family, there's that safety net of the family that helps avoid some of that anxiety of the world. You are not going to Mass on your own. There may be times where that has to happen with an older teenager, certainly. But that strength in a family and strength in looking to God and giving everything to God and coming to Mass together, in my mind, can't be topped by anything else. In our minds, can't be topped by anything else. When it comes to, I guess, one comment on the scenario where the parent says, oh, he's a teenager, we talked a little bit about when children are little, maybe they have some behaviors that we're trying to fix, and maybe we're going to talk about it in front of their siblings, but remember, we're not going to talk about it outside of the house. We want to protect them and protect their reputation or their character to the world, but yet still have them learn from it. And when we as parents are willing to just throw them under the bus, even to a professional, you should be able to talk to your pediatrician for sure, easily. But I would ask that it's done in a way that doesn't make it seem like you don't care so much about them. They are so important to us as as parents, I know those comments only are made sometimes just out of being hurt a little bit because things have gotten a little rocky. But it's important as parents not to let our sadness or our feelings of maybe even a little defeat cause us to put somebody else down, put one of our children down. And so trying to address those situations in a way that still protects them as a person, I think is really important. As you talk about not just dating issues, but more I'm thinking about, that the discussion of how life goes and how bodies are changing, and then ultimately how, if you're meant to be married and have a family, you're wanting to talk about life and how God set up life to be between a husband and a wife. If you have laid everything out as respect for the individual, respect for yourself, because God gives us life and gives us everything, it makes that conversation about life and having a family so much more straightforward. In our first week, we talked about, if we remember the goal of helping our children have the gifts, develop their gifts given by God, so that they may serve God and ultimately get to heaven, that parenting is more straightforward. Even in the teenage years, and even when you're talking about family life and where they may be headed, it's more straightforward. So then it makes your discussion about dating more straightforward. What does dating look like? Or what is the goal of dating? Well, first, it's about establishing healthy friendships. Too much alone time is not good for teenagers in dating. And again, we're trying to set kids up for success. We want them, if they want to have somebody that they're kind of interested in, if they want to get them to know them better, maybe they're going to have them around the family a little bit. But it doesn't mean all the time has to be around the family. But it's important, even for children who typically make good decisions, to still have those boundaries. So that means they don't need to be out extremely late. They don't need to be spending lots of one-on-one time. There needs to be time to talk, and so maybe when they're in the car, they have the radio off so they're getting to know one another. But it should always be built around respect for the other person and the expectation that they are going to be respected. And that in virtue, there are those sacred parts of life that are saved for marriage, and for marriage only. And so for your husband or your wife. And there shouldn't ever be any question about that. It doesn't mean that there might not be, or that there might be it doesn't mean there won't be temptations at times, especially if people feel like they're in love. But what do? You set them up for success. You don't have them watching a movie together by themselves in the dark, and go to bed. You want them around the family. You want to put them in a spot that is going to help them follow the rules that they know they want to follow and please God.
So we would start off high school years trying to have some guidelines for dating. It's really frustrating if you're the child and the rules seem arbitrary. And in fact, that's probably frustrating for all of us in any situation if we think the rules are arbitrary. And so kids starting off high school in our house would have a general idea that as freshmen, they aren't going to date. As sophomores, they would likely be able to date once every 3 weeks. As juniors, every other week. And as seniors, once a week. Those rules might be adjusted if they weren't dating the same person each of those times. Your biggest concern as a parent is that somebody is going to get way wrapped up in one person and that they pin all their hopes and dreams for the rest of their life on this new guy that they met 2 weeks ago and they're sophomores in high school. That's diving in a little too hard. And so as a parent, you're always just trying to tap the brake. And so you set these rules up ahead of time so that you don't seem arbitrary. You're not going to be able to pick the person that your kids are interested in. And so you set the rules up so that gives them some time to think. in between dates as a sophomore about what it was like, how it went, thinking about this person, and especially teenagers need some quiet time to think. They want the radio on all the time. They really don't want it to be quiet at all. And it's a lot harder to think if you don't have some quiet time. So, make sure that you are talking about prayer time and quiet time and contemplation time. That's important. And in the midst of following your dating rules, it's also important that if you show signs of weakness or maybe that there's laxity in those rules, you should expect for all of those rules to be tested very frequently. So you're at a basketball game and you're watching one of the younger siblings, but one of the older siblings has a person of interest show up at the basketball game, and afterward there's a little discussion about those two going to Dairy Queen just for a quick ice cream cone, and then they'll go their separate ways. And my response to that would probably be, that's okay if you want your date for the next 3 weeks to have been that trip to Dairy Queen, that's fine. And typically the response would be, well, Dad, that's really not a date. And I said, well, whether you have a date is up to you, but what a date is up to me. And so, in my view, we're going to call that a date. The trouble is, if it's not a date, that kind of thing could happen every night of the week. And so now we're seeing each other every night of the week. And we're getting closer and closer. And you as a parent are not tapping the brakes at all. I want to throw in just the phone on top of that. That if you've got texting capability, if you're the student and you've got texting capability and your person of interest has texting capability, you can be in contact with each other 24 hours a day. Now, we grew up before cell phones and texting were around. I know at my house I have rules on how long I could be on the phone talking to the person that I was interested in. There was a time limit, and it was going to be you were allowed to talk once and not multiple phone calls back.
Get the batteries.
And now, with texting capabilities, and kids can really smother each other. And if the last person that you talk to at night is the person that you're dating via texting, and the first person you talk to in the morning is the person you're dating and you're texting, that's getting to be an awful lot like marriage. And it's not hard to see how kids become confused and think that this has got to be forever. Look how well we match up. But mostly, for those early relationships, things match up because of proximity, not because there's a real connection in the things that are important in life. And so Jennifer mentioned these last week on 3 big things that are a foundation for a good marriage, and that is that you worship the same way, which for our kids, we are expecting that they're going to marry somebody who's Roman Catholic so that they can worship the same way. Because this is the church that Christ set up. And if they're going to raise kids, how would they be able to raise kids with the thought that this is the church that Christ set up? The person that they're married to doesn't believe that this is the church that Christ set up. That's going to create conflict, particularly in the child's eyes, is to figure out which parent is telling them the truth. Second thing would be that you're going to spend money the same way. If you look at the reasons why people fight and get divorced, money is right up there at the top of the list. And it doesn't matter how much money people have. There will be huge conflicts if you have one person who's a saver and one who's a spender. And so it's important for people just to identify that. And that's not something that should be expected to get better after people get married.
out as they go along, probably is going to be a big source of conflict. And then finally, how you're going to raise kids. Somebody who says, I could never do anything that makes my child cry is not going to get along very well with somebody who thinks that kids need to listen and obey, or they need to understand that there are going to be consequences for that behavior. And those are going to be two pretty opposing views, and it's going to be difficult to figure out how they're going to meet in the middle. Chances are that the parents are going to be played off. One's going to be played off as being too easy and the other one too strict. And my guess is that the kids are always going to go to the parent who is consoling and could never do anything that would make the child cry, which will make the parent who's more the disciplinarian look like the bad guy and be more frustrated and probably try to overcompensate by providing too much discipline at times. And you can see how it just kind of is like a snowball rolling down the hill.
And so as kids are dating, those would be three really important things. Not that somebody is going to decide after 5 dates that they want to be Roman Catholic, but that would be part of the reason for having people come around the family, just to see what this is like. What's it like in practice? How does that operate? What does that family feel like when I'm with them? What's it like to be around a supper table with 7 kids, 2 parents, and me? What's that? That experience can be really different for somebody who grows up in a house that's different than ours. And I would say that generally it's pretty attractive to people.
Just one thing about the phone and talking late at night or first thing in the morning, we still think even high schoolers should have if they have a phone, it should be in our or the parents' room, just to avoid some of that. And having your child know that you can check the phone, you have that liberty at any time is great. But also, if things have already been happening, you can't erase that, kind of like we had talked before. So trying to be careful about where that phone is, and if they're talking. So we would encourage, if they're going to talk with friends or the person they're dating, it's a voice call, or maybe it's a FaceTime at this point. But it should be with doors open. You don't want too many closed door conversations. In general, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I think we had talked a little about like when kids are studying or working on their computer. Ideally, you want them out in the main area. But if for some reason they're on an electronic device in their room, the door should be open.
Yeah, that's just to reinforce your thoughts that as a parent, sometimes people will feel like it's really important to give their kids space, and that bedroom almost becomes their property of the teenager. And that's a really lousy idea, that this is our house, it's the whole family's. Your siblings that don't sleep in the same room are going to knock and ask for permission to come in. But that door should only really be closed if there's way too much noise out here, which parents can have some control over, or if you're changing clothes, then it's fine for that door to be closed. Otherwise, the door should be open at least part way, and we'll knock too before we come in, but there shouldn't be anything that's going on in that room that should be a problem for us to walk in. And there shouldn't be anything so secretive going on in there that you wouldn't feel good about anybody else being part of that.
One thing that can be kind of tricky is, even in middle school, the normal pattern for a person is to want some of that space, to feel like they want some of their own area, they want some alone time. Some alone time is fine, and they need that in order to think. Sometimes they will want to wear earbuds all the time or have something on their ears, so they're listening to their own thing, even out and about with the family. And it's not good for that to be going on all the time, because that sends the message that I'm in my own world, don't disturb me, I don't really want to hear what you're saying, or maybe I want to hear it, but I don't want you to know I hear it, and I certainly don't want you to talk to me. And that can be a normal part of adolescence, but not an acceptable one. And so I would be careful about feeling intimidated by that. Sometimes adolescents may not seem like they still want the hugs they wanted in elementary school, and it's painful, but it doesn't mean that they don't really need those hugs. They still need to be touched by mom and dad. It's going to be different, and maybe it probably shouldn't be in front of their friends, but they still need that. I mentioned earlier, used the phrase unconditional love. That doesn't mean there aren't consequences. And so, especially if we are in these later teen years and there's a behavior going on that is not right, not going to lead them to God, that means, oops, they've had too much freedom. And so you have to retract that. That's our responsibility as parents. And you love them. They may tell you that you don't love them, but you're doing it because you do. And sometimes it hurts when the kids remind me that I have said, I'm not here to be your best friend, I'm here to be your parent or your mom. I want to be their best friend, but my job is to be their parent, to be their mom. And not that we really have big things that come up. I was chuckling a little to myself when Andy was talking about exactly what constitutes a date. The kids have decided if we go to Lowe's on an errand, we've had our date. So anyway, so they get it. I guess my just point on that last is don't be afraid to pull back in on the reins. If you have given your child a phone and you're second guessing that, or it's clear that maybe that was more freedom than they're ready for, the temptations were too great, it's just an explanation that we're going to need to keep the phone. That isn't working. I don't feel like it's best for you. We've got to do it my way. And that's okay. And we're allowed to make adjustments as we go.
I never cease to be amazed at the lousy behavior that parents are willing to put up with, and yet their child still has a phone. It is time to man up. Why in the world would you let somebody talk back to you and then pay $20 or $30 a month so they can have a phone, so they can have contact with their friends? They don't need any contact with their friends if they're talking back. They need to get their life figured out. And the only way to do that is plenty of time around the family and feeling like they're only going to earn their life back an inch at a time, and it's through complying with the rules of the house. You're certainly going to supply them with food and love, but pretty much everything else is negotiable. There are going to be times where Dr. Ray Garendi talks about shutting somebody's life down, where they might sleep on a mattress with a sheet, and they earn things back as they get their life back together. That might need to happen for some kids who really have their life disordered. Most kids don't need that. But I think especially with the phone, because I view it as such a bad object to begin with, why in the world would you have somebody behaving in a way that's not conducive to family life or in any way good for them, and still allow them to have this bad thing in their life? So it's time to take back control of that if you're not getting what you want as a parent.
I would even say, if you're in a situation, even to that extreme, that's still information within the family. And if your child chooses to share that information with people outside the family, that's their choice. But I would say, my thought is still, I'm going to protect my child. I'm not telling all about their troubles to my coworkers, to my friends, to my sister-in-law, to no one. This is between us. This is not about trying to show what a good parent I am or how strict I am. It's about trying to help my child get beyond this mountain, whatever it might be.
And that also would include even younger kids, like 4 and 5-year-olds. Family gatherings are not the time to have this catharsis where all the parents talk about all the lousy ways that their kids torture them. It is so awful for a child to hear, oh yeah, he's my ornery one, he's my troublemaker, that it becomes such a self-fulfilling prophecy when these little ears hear that and they look up and they see all the adults looking at them. And it's almost like, okay, game on. If you're going to call me that, then here we go. And so say that. If you want to say that somebody is really determined or they've got a lot of spirit, okay, because those can be good qualities too. They don't have to be pejorative. But if somebody is a troublemaker, it's pretty hard to view that in any way other than it's not good. And so if you need to have a catharsis, my advice is have a catharsis with your spouse. You're both in it together. Talk about it together. Devise a plan on how you're going to approach that. If you don't think you have a plan, then talk to your pediatrician. We're honestly not counselors, and so we give lots of advice on anticipatory guidance on how to help you get to where you want to be. But sometimes people are going to have problems that are bigger than what we would be good at handling and outside of our training. And so we'll have families go talk to counselors and come to church and get advice from people in church. There are better ways of dealing with problems with your kids than just letting the whole world know that you got a lousy kid.
And I would even say, you don't have a lousy kid. Remember, God created them, and they are a gift to your family no matter what. It may be hard at times. I don't think God ever said parenting was going to be easy at all times, but it is a gift, just as our faith is a gift. I wanted to comment too on the back talk. Remember, sometimes even in the little child, it's the or the stomping of the foot that's in my mind equivalent to back talk. A teenager who doesn't look you in the eye, that's as bad as back talk. Or maybe they're going to mumble under their breath their opinion of how unfair this is. That's disrespectful, and that means they need to come back. And maybe you're not even going to talk, but they need to be in the room with you. Being off to themselves, brooding about how evil they think their parents are because they're so strict, isn't really going to help. And so, maybe they're going to think it anyway, but you should keep them around. If you are feeling angry, it's better to take a pause. Once you have said something that is hateful or demeaning, they will remember it forever. You are the person who is supposed to love them no matter what. And when those awful words come out of our mouths, if they do, you cannot pull them back. And it is like a painful arrow into them. So, anyway, not that people can't heal when bad things happen, but in our mind, we want to prevent that. We want to avoid that at all costs. So you want to be always in charge of your emotions. Oh, he was just saying to remind me to say, we don't want to ground kids to their rooms. When we talk about timeouts with our toddlers, even then we want to keep them around. You have them sit down and do their timeout not too far away. You want them to want to be with the family. Teenagers, you don't want them grounded per se, which we don't really even use that word grounded. I mean, it seems like punishment. We're in this to help our kids be their best, use their gifts. I don't know, I'm not in it for the punishment, I suppose, so I'm not going to call it grounding, but don't send them to their rooms, because then it's too easy for the anger just to build up and for them to want to explode. So I think we're going to just open it up for questions. Now, hopefully this has been helpful. We love child development. We love being pediatricians. We are gratefully blessed that God allowed us to be parents. And if we can be of help to anybody, we certainly would like to be. So, are there any questions?
We've already, the phone is gone, the door is gone. Like, there's been a lot of steps taken. But that bond between the two, like, they love each other, they're best friends. And we love this other
So the question is, when children are really close growing up, but then they reach kind of early teenage years, and maybe that best friend is making choices that we know are not good for our child, how do you go about that? How do you kind of make that change? And I think at 14, it makes sense to talk to her directly and say, we care about her, we want what's best for her, but right now these choices we're afraid, gonna lead you in a bad direction. It doesn't mean you're not kind to her. It doesn't mean that you befriend, don't be a friend with her, but we don't want you spending time with her. We pray for her. When I think of kids who are kind of in a rut making some bad decisions, I think of St. Monica, and what she do, she just kept praying. St. Augustine, he had his troubles there for a little bit, and she just kept praying. And so talking to, like my daughter, or, your daughter, about praying for her friend and talking about how to make better choices, but how, again, we're trying to set ourselves up for making good choices, setting ourselves up for success. So that means not putting temptation for bad decision making right there in front of us. And I wouldn't waver. You mentioned you'd already taken a phone and you're setting the right obstacles in place. And I wouldn't waver. It's too important. And someday she'll probably see it. It's just hard to see it when you're right there in the middle of it.
I don't think you're probably going to have any effect on what goes on at school, because when kids are around each other, they're just around each other. There's not a whole lot of damage that can be done there anyway. And so mostly you're just trying to limit access. And that's about the limit of what you can do, is limit access. So if you're doing that, you're doing your job. Even if your daughter isn't excited about what you're doing and can't see any of it, sometimes your brain just isn't there. You can't see it because you don't understand what all these possible ramifications are for what this other person is doing and how they're setting themselves up and how they're presenting themselves to the world. And so I don't know that it's not one of those where it's great, we made this move, and wow, by a week later, we're back to being friends again. If you're friends for that long, it's going to be hard for a child to be able to see that. And I think it is good, if that situation would arise again. Maybe there were some signs a little earlier that you could have seen looking back now, where you thought, we realize now they don't parent the same way we do. And that's when you start to limit access, when you can tell that another house operates in a way that's different than yours. That's going to be maybe a friend who comes to your house, but we're not going to go over there. And if it's clear that somebody else has a lot of freedom, we're probably going to start limiting exposure pretty early, because all that freedom is usually, we have this concupiscence that is our tendency to do the wrong thing as human beings, and given too much freedom without a brain that's ready to handle it. Well, how many adults, how many times do we err? And we've supposedly got mature brains, but too much freedom too early usually is going to result in bad outcomes. So it's hard, because some of that you can only see in retrospect. And most of us are, our first child teaches us an awful lot. But then you get pretty good as, and I will tell people in the office that it may be bad for cops to profile. That's an argument for other people, but parents absolutely have to profile. You want to look in those eyes of that child that your child's going to be around, and you want to see what's in there. And if you can't even find their eyes because they won't make direct eye contact with you, either they've really got poor self-esteem or they're trying to hide something from you. And my first impulse as a parent is, I'm thinking they've got something that they're trying to hide from me, because I'm supposed to protect. That's my job as dad, is I'm supposed to be a protector and a provider. And so I think you're doing the best you can at this point. You've done all the right stuff.
Well, the hard part is that she's not. The
Yes.
Opposed, like, she doesn't get in trouble. And reflecting on time.
Yes. And
Our
so,
child is with us.
yes.
So that's, but it was the connection they had that was hard for us
Right.
to know what to do.
Yes, and so the rest of that was that this other person is somebody who isn't exhibiting a life of faith and is questioning whether there's a God at all. And so what kids at our house would hear commonly is you're known by the company that you keep, and that somebody who doesn't, at least for me as a parent, if I'm aware that somebody doesn't have that sense of responsibility to God, it's going to be pretty hard for me to give them freedom with my child, because they don't really have any basis for the decisions that they're making that would be anything deeper than what occurs to them at the time. And so, yeah, tough. That's a really tough spot to be in, but I admire you for the strong stance that you're taking, because that's hard to do too. It makes for some really tough days in a house where everybody's, you want to be together and you are a loving family, but sometimes the decisions you have to make as a parent, those hurt. They don't feel good to the person who's having to receive that. So that's good job. I think we're done. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for letting us do this.